Basic training, ASG Cloud Factory, architecture requirements and installation of CloudStore. This is part number 3. It is important and recommended for you to also look ASG Cloud Factory 8.1 ARI Cloud Robot video. That explains a few components, including the RabbitMQ piece of the installation. So let's talk about our agenda and the modules covered in this particular training. So the first one is the introduction we already covered in this particular module, CloudStore architecture, CloudStore requirements, prepare the infrastructure, and the actual installation. So let's talk about the CloudStore architecture. So the overview in Cloud Factory, we need to remember the software components that we interact when we deploy the entire stack. So the deployment lifecycle, we always talk about Cloud Shaper. On the workflow and self-services, we always talk about Cloud Robot, where we have the workflows and activities. And on top of that, we have the dynamic hybrid workspace, which is called CLOUDCOCKPIT. And also we have the relationship with CloudStore. So they work together, and of course the interaction between store and robot happens, naturally for a provisioning of deprovisioning of services. So that gives an overview of how users interact with Cloud Factory stack and its modules. So always it starts from the Cloud Cockpit to store, robot, app mirror, and other components. So that leads to the requirements part, which is the third module of the installation. The basic requirements for the CloudStore and best practices on the operating system level. It's always we use Windows 2008 R2 or Windows Server 2012 for the CloudStore server. Make sure you have Internet Information Services installed and configured. Microsoft ASP.NET Road installed and activated. And for the RabbitMQ components, you must be installed before the CloudStore installation, and that is covered in the Cloud Robot video tutorial. The same thing needs to be to make sure it is a Windows service running prior to installation, otherwise it will fail. And MongoDB has to be installed and configured as a Windows service. It is also configured in the Cloud Robot video. So when you have that preparation completed, what we can do is move towards the product installation. And for the final step, as we said, the installation of CloudStore in live demo. So before we do that, let's review the flow. So first we need to do the organization units and groups created, install RabbitMQ, install the MongoDB, install the workflow engine. And when Cloud Robot is completed, we can install CloudStore in the same server or in a different server. We'll do in a different server. And then finally configure the link between CloudCockpit and CloudStore. And that will complete the installation process. So for you to verify before we start, these are the services that you might see installed in the particular server. Here in the bottom, we'll see the CloudStore, the query engine controller, notification, and the approval services. Encryption in this case, it's also going to be installed automatically. With that being said, it is time to do the live installation. Okay, so now we are here in the web server. It is where I have CloudCockpit already installed, and I will open the installation folders. This is the setup media that we installed from the ISP. We go here to Cloud Robot and we will run the installer. We'll click Next, Accept. We unselect all the components and we're going to include approval, notification, query engine controller, and store, and click Install. We will use the default folder for approval. We can leave the approval services as wildcard 9000, or you could put the host name that you have. So let's click on Next. Where's the bus? In this case, installed on the app server. And the MongoDB is already installed locally. The approval URL, the query engine server, is installed on the app server as well. If you want to send emails, you can enable and put the configuration for that. And the service now is installed. Completed. Next. Now we go to the notification service. In this case, the notification service I will install on the web server. So I will just put web. SMTP settings, we actually are using an Exchange server, so we need to put Exchange. It's where Exchange is running. MongoDB information is correct. Click Next. Oops. User, I use the default credentials. Completed. And now the query engine controller. This is the host, it's correct. The query engine controller is where we are installing the same server. And the installation is completed. And now we will do the MongoDB login. So here we're going to use the default settings for the MongoDB. RabbitMQ we need to change to where we installed, previously installed in the app server. And this is the CloudCockpit URL. So we need to use the one that I configured previously, which is CloudCockpit. I will disable the auto-configure single sign-on because we will configure the certificates in a later phase. And this is specifically for the identity provider configuration. Let's click on Next. Query engine is correct. Approval service is correct. And now this is the final step, validating if the install was successful or not. Okay, it's installing the packages. That means the installation happened properly on the web server side. And it's completed. Click on Next. And this completes the installation of CloudCockpit. So let's verify the installed packages as we just discussed a few minutes ago. We can see the packages installed correctly, and we can also verify the services. Approval is running, notification is running, and the query engine is running, and store job scheduling is running. That means the installation was done successfully. Now that we have CloudStore installed, we need to set up the configuration or integration between CloudStore and CloudCockpit and WSL. So there are a few steps that we have to follow here. The first one is enable store and access in WSL. This is a configuration file to be changed. And then we will go to the CloudCockpit server and store server to set up the certificates, configure the identity provider, the CFS metadata, which is required for every identity you create. Then we'll go to CloudStore and make a couple of modifications in the web.conf. Finally, do some testing, and then finally configure the link to CloudCockpit and CloudStore. So for that configuration, what I did, I took screenshots of my environment because basically we're just adding some configuration to the files. So first we go to the VSL.CONF in the Linux server. In the Windows, I think it's a different folder, but it's the same configuration file. And right below your CloudCockpit configuration, what you do, you add a second line for CloudFactory store. And I will just go to the Linux server shortly and show you that configuration. So here in the VSL.CONF, right below the CloudCockpit, as I just mentioned, I included a new line for proxy path and another one for reverse. And in this case, I just added CloudFactory store, same way we did for the CloudCockpit server. Once it's completed, we save the configuration, we use Apache -t to make sure syntax is okay, and we restart the Apache configuration using Apache restart command. No messages came back. It means the Apache has been restarted properly. So now we can go to the next step. The next step is the certificate configuration. So let's assume you exported the certificate using IIS. So you have the PFX file, it's already in the server. And using MMC certificates for local computer, not user, right-click on the certificate, all tasks, manage private keys, and add the security level for us to access the certificate. In this case, I'm using everyone because it's a proof of concept environment. In a production system, you just need to make sure you add the right permission levels, like administrators or group of users that you want to allow them to access this certificate. Then you need to copy the certificate file to CloudStore. And in this case, program files, CloudStore, web, external certificates, and use the name mycfdemoLocal or the name of the environment that you have. And now we will link it to our identity provider. So we will edit the file called identityprovider.xml. Below you will see the path where this file is located. And we will have to make sure we correct the issuer. So here we can see the name of my website, the service base URL, and the STC URL. And I have actually in the next slide a very easy way to match that information based upon the certificate that you have. Big trick here to make sure you do it right. On the certificate name, make sure this OU, O, L, S, and C are properly mapped. And the second step is you need to include a trust relationship and make sure the ID is unique for every identity provider you add. Otherwise, you will see an error message coming in the event viewer. In this case, I added ID number 5. And the metadata that I will be using, it's called CFSMETADATA, and the Trust Identity Provider website. Do you recognize this link? It's the same that we just configured in the VSL. So how do I map it in a very easy way? This particular illustration shows you a screenshot of the end result. So I can see my CFDemoLocal. I logged in Cockpit and then I went to Store. And if I look into my CFDemoLocal, these are the locations that we just discussed. And the details of the certificates, the IT, ASG, Naples, Florida, US, coming from the details. If you do this mapping, it will make your job much easier. Then we need to edit the CFSMETADATA.XML. The first time this file does not exist. You need to create one. You can copy from an existing one or use the same content as we have here. What do you need to change? Two different places. The entity ID, this is the website CloudStore will be responding. And in the bottom, the binding component location needs to be specified as well. Just make sure in the second URL you have /AC configured. And the final step is you go to the web.conf file in CloudStore and you make sure you set up the CloudCockPit URL. In this case, it is mycfdemo.local. I use HTTPS in my environment, so you need to make sure that follows in yours as well. The second step for the web.conf, we do not have billing in use or installed, so I will change the key for Meveo fake from false to true, and also the Meveo fake response from false will be true. And the last configuration to be changed in the web.conf file, it is the service provider configuration. So this is the last piece to make sure we close the loop. First piece to add, in fact this requires a lot of changes. The service provider, the assertion consumer URL, the AC that we just did on the CFS metadata. What is my login URL for single sign-on service? What is the logout URL, which will change depending how you implement WSL in Linux, Windows, or even using TMG. The root distinguished name, in this case, you need to be careful that you validate your domain controller and location. And where is your certificate installed? We saw that previously we pasted into external certificates. Here is my CF demo local SIR. And I'm not using LDP signature validation at this point. It would be important to enable it in production. So in this case, it's true. The root access is also enabled. If you want to ignore again, change this to false, and then it won't ignore anymore, and then you have the certificate validation. And to make end users access easier to CloudStore, we will now show you how to configure the link between CloudCockpit and CloudStore. And essentially, there are only 4 steps. We'll go to the admin console. We will go to webtops, create a new webtop, and assign this particular webtop to the end user. So now we are in the CloudFactory admin console. I'm going to user interface components, webtops, edit mode, and I will add a new link here called CloudStore. The description you can define, for example, store. I use all capital letters, for example. And I will include an extra tag here that will be the actual link for us to use it. So I'll paste it. I will just change to my website is my cfdemo.local, and on configurator I will include a new CloudStore component. I'll save it, and I will now assign to the organization entity. So I'll go to default, edit the mode, adding for all users. I'll click save. And now I will go to CloudStore or CloudCockpit, and then I'll see the link in the flying in menu. Let's go there now. So here in CloudCockpit Secure Logon, I'll click on username and password. I will log on with my administrator user at this point. Once we are in, we can just scroll over workspaces, and now I can see here CloudStore. I'll click on it. Let's wait for the single sign-on agent to trigger. We're validating the identity. And now we are here in CloudStore.